Do you also find it difficult to build up a meaningful relationship with your grandchildren at a distance? As a long-distance aunt to a 2-year-old in Australia, I wanted to create a solution for the millions of family members who cannot be physically together all the time. This is why I created Peekabond, an app that helps you to connect with young children at a distance. The app works with the following 3 steps. First, we give playful activities suggestions that are based on your child's development stage. These suggestions are science-based and gamified. Secondly, you can create a private family circle. And finally, we'll let you send videos back and forth so you don't have to be live at the same time and save them in one spot for your grandchild to watch. We've got over 120 content suggestions. You can build a love bank for your grandchildren. And if you go to the Cool Grandpa website and look for the affiliate links, sign up for a newsletter with a lot of inspiring content, or you can try the app for free.
Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readio. I strongly recommend Readio to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readio makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readio, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. I just wanted to remind you guys that I am starting to launch the speaking practice. Behind the scenes, I'm getting some things put together so I can start reaching out to organizations to talk about leadership from a grandfather's perspective. Now, if you think this might be a topic that your organization would enjoy hearing, please reach out to me. Ask me some questions. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. The other thing, too, that I've got going on is this personal podcast. What we do is we get your family members together all on a Zoom call. We talk about your grandfather or another member of the family, where I act as the MC, ask some questions, get feedback. This is a great family artifact that stays with your family, and you guys can share it with whomever you like. So if you're interested in finding out more about this personal podcast offering, please go to my website, check it out, and then shoot me an email. Hi, and welcome into the Cool Grandpa podcast. I have a really unique conversation for you today. I've been lucky enough to have a sit-down conversation with Dr. Rob Whitley. Now, Rob is a specialist in men's mental health. And what I really enjoyed about our conversation and getting Dr. Whitley on is our conversation focused on the mental well-being of us grandpas. You know, we all go through changes. We all have ups and downs, but there are some things that are unique to our own mental health. And if we're not paying attention, and if we don't have our loved ones paying attention and keeping an eye out for us, sometimes that can lead to some really negative consequences. So we discuss an awful lot of books and articles and theories, and I've been able to put those links down in the show notes. So there are a ton of links in the show notes for this episode. So after you're done listening, be sure to check out the website, cool-grandpa.us, find this episode, and check out some of these articles that we are discussing and referencing. So without further ado, let's jump into this important conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and talk with us about this important topic of mental health with, we'll call ourselves older gentlemen.
Well, I like that, Greg. I've been called many things, and that's one of the more complimentary things.
Now, one of the items that I'd like to talk about as we start talking about mental health with middle-aged, grandfather-type aged individuals is, with mental health, are we talking primarily about depression and anxiety starting to manifest themselves as we're getting into these, let's say, late 40s on up, or are there other mental health issues that can manifest themselves during this time period?
Yeah, well, the phrase mental health is a kind of trendy phrase, but it's a very broad phrase. It's an umbrella term. It's a kind of catch-all term that can be used to refer to discrete mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders. These are all contained in a book called DSM-5, which is produced by the American Psychiatric Association, which categorizes official mental illnesses. So that's one way of looking at kind of mental health is through the prism of DSM and the different mental illnesses. Another way we use the term mental health is to refer to kind of less tangible kind of processes, or what we sometimes call soft variables. These are not official mental illnesses, but they're phenomena that influence the experience of life for many people. And the kind of phenomena I'm thinking about here are kind of loneliness, isolation, feelings of kind of shame or guilt that some people have as life progresses, feelings of like inertia, kind of low energy, but not really flourishing and thriving and reaching your full potential. But just to go back to your introduction, that the two most common mental illnesses are depression and anxiety, and typically they do start in the 20s, but for many people they do start later in life, in like 30s, 40s, even 50s. And in terms of men, we also need to think about suicide. So we know that 75% of suicides are made by men. And that the middle-aged men are the demographic of all the age demographics who have the highest rates of suicide. And behind that, we also have to think about substance use issues. So we do know that men are much more likely to have substance use issues compared to women. And this can involve white-collar men, blue-collar men, manual workers, professionals. We're talking about addictions to alcohol, addiction to cannabis, addictions to opioids, addiction to cocaine and other drugs, which occurs across the socioeconomic spectrum. So mental health is a very broad term, and that's a way of kind of breaking it down into different components.
No, I appreciate you doing that, because with my limited experience, I understand that sometimes when we use that broad term mental health, that a lot of times, let's say chemical depression, other types of mental health can sometimes manifest themselves in adolescence. But then I was wondering too, and I think you clarified this, that when we get into later in life, that those types of mental health manifestations aren't necessarily coming out, but it is this detachment from social groups, the loneliness, the anxiety about job performance, for example, or family situation, divorce, loss of children, even at this age. So I appreciate you kind of clarifying that for me.
Yeah, and we should also say that there's a big link between mental health and physical health. So in terms of the topic of today's show, as people age and as men age, particularly men, say, for example, who work in manual professions, who work in trades, who are working with their hands, working outdoors, there's wear and tear on the body. And I don't want to get too technical, but many of the physical systems, the muscular system, the cardiovascular system, under a lifetime of certain stresses, testosterone can decrease. That men who in their 20s and 30s had a lot of physical strength, were maybe sexually more virile, had their life ahead of them are suddenly having this realization that, mentally and physically things are somewhat on a downward path, and that doesn't mean they're inevitably downward and we can't help halt them and obviously keep fit, etc. But there's an interaction between that kind of that physical health and mental health, which means when you get to, I'm in my 50s, my age, people in their 40s, that there are things which you used to have which you don't have anymore, whether it's, physical strength, whether it's a large group of male friends that you may have had who have moved all over the country due to their profession, whether it's financial and work success, which may be elusive for some men, especially in the current economy and the war in Ukraine, etc. So there's a lot of interacting variables which we need to consider in this topic.
Well, and that's interesting that you were bringing that up, because I've recently just had back surgery a couple of months ago. So I'm in this place of I'm getting back and I'm getting better, but I was able to pause a little bit and reflect on men that had their value out of physical performance, right? Whether it was athletes, and it could be professional athletes, or it could be people that love to play softball on the weekend. And now you can't do it. You've had knee injuries, or it's just age creeping up on you. And it's interesting that I think all of this fits around what we used to joke about as far as the midlife crisis, right? About, oh, well, the man's maybe going off and having an affair, buying the Corvette is a cliche, these different things. But there may have been a lot of those were happening as a way of dealing with this loss of who we used to be and where that identity came from a physical standpoint.
Yeah, most definitely. And on the topic of your podcast, many men, as they're aging, they're looking forward to playing with their children or their grandchildren, playing soccer in the park or softball, taking them fishing or swimming in the river, on the beach, hiking in the mountains, introducing them to the outdoors, teaching them skills in carpentry or gardening or mechanics. And it is an age where there is an increase in physical illnesses, physical health issues, especially people who have worked, like I said, in certain professions. So many things which men hoped for in their kind of 40s and 50s and 60s. There are a large portion of men who aren't able to actualize that. And then that brings us on to the opioid abuse and opioid epidemic. And sometimes when I talk to this about students, they say to me, right, that's terrible, but that's affecting, men who live in these post-industrial towns who never had a job and live with their mothers and who've been taking cannabis since they were 14 and now they're taking opioids. And I tell them, well, actually, the figures don't show that. Many men who are addicted to opioids and painkillers are men who have your experience, Greg, that you just said. They had a back operation. Maybe they were somebody who was a mechanic or a roofer or in the military, in the police, have chronic pain issues. They were prescribed opioids by a doctor, and they said to themselves, well, I'm a policeman, I'm a military guy, there's no way I'm going to get addicted. I don't have that kind of personality. I've never taken an illegal drug in my life. But then suddenly it controls the pain. These things do have addictive qualities. They try and wean themselves off and they can't. Then they go to the doctor and ask for more. And then some of them end up trying to buy it on the black market. So these variables really do intersect. And it's important when we think about these things like opioid issues, biological degradation in the human body, mental health, that they all intertwine and they can affect anyone, no matter how rich, how poor, how professional, how educated you are.
I totally agree with that. And the other part too, I think, was with the addictions, whether it could be alcohol or opioids or whatever an addiction could be. I mean, it could be mountain climbing, that you're out constantly and you're taking unnecessary risks. But there can be also on the backside of that too, along with the recovery, but the shame spiral that comes into it. Like you said, if I had my self-worth was I was always the strongest member of the family, people relied on me, I could always help move the piano. I could always do these things. I'm not the face of opioid addiction or any kind of an addiction. And then the next thing you know, you are part of that, and you have that to deal with.
We just completed a little study where we were looking at people who use medical cannabis in Canada. So in Canada, medical cannabis is completely legal, and Veterans Affairs Canada, which is the equivalent of the US Veterans Administration, will actually reimburse the costs of cannabis for individuals who have a legitimate medical diagnosis. And we learned in that process that many men, former military, former police, former manual workers, people who worked in oil, gas, lifting things, moving things, working on the roof, etc., had such chronic pain issues, went on opioids. The opioids turned them into zombies. This is their words, not mine. And then they went to medical cannabis, and they said that kind of helped them. But that was a huge internal journey for them, because, like I said, many of them were former police, former military. They always thought cannabis was a terrible drug, and they didn't want to be associated with what they considered was a kind of gateway drug and a formerly illegal substance, which is a long way of saying that for many men, this age is a kind of journey of discovery, and a journey that the things that you previously liked, maybe you cannot engage in any longer, or not to the same extent. And by the same token, there are things which previously you didn't think were part of who you were, or a legitimate response to adversity, which men are engaging in. So there's an upside and a downside of this journey of aging, I guess one could say.
One of the things that popped into mind was the idea of, as we age, moving into a mentor role, or moving into a different role within the activities that we used to participate in. And you see this, I think, with baseball, with different sports, that as an athlete sometimes ages out of being able to physically play, that they move into a coaching role or something else that's still associated with that. And have you found that sometimes eases that, I don't know, the disassociation between what used to be and where somebody ends up as they get older?
Well, I think the research shows that's one of the most mentally healthy things that an older person of a certain age can do, is to get involved in kind of mentorship, training, supervision, helping younger people. There is a psychologist called Erickson who developed a concept known as generativity. And according to Erickson, generativity encompasses three aspects: procreativity, productivity, and creativity, which basically means the generation of new ideas, new products, or new or renewed humans, one could say, in the younger generation. And there are different forms of generativity beyond that. For example, biological generativity is having children, grandchildren, parental. There's also kind of cultural generativity, technical generativity. So this concept, I feel, is really important for kind of the middle adulthood years. We do know that kind of men who are involved in youth clubs, maybe in like army cadet formations, church leadership positions, little league sports clubs, etc., that can be very helpful to their mental health. But then it's important to say that men don't live their life in a vacuum. The social context has changed, so we do know also that many of those organizations I just described have diminished in number across the United States and the Western world. So there's a Harvard sociologist called Robert Putnam who wrote a book called Bowling Alone, where he actually looked year by year on the membership of these kind of little league baseball clubs, of cadet formations, of youth clubs, and finding that they're kind of disappearing. PTAs, fraternal organizations, trade unions, church memberships, and that they're all kind of going down. And that there's also a bit of a kind of stigmatization sometimes of men in some of these conditions. So in the UK, for example, you have to jump through a whole load of hoops if you want to become a youth club leader, for example, or a church leader. And understandably so. There's been kind of sexual abuse scandals in the UK and Ireland and other countries. But in a way, it's become a lot more difficult to become one of those kind of formal or informal helpers. And some people are just thinking to themselves, well, that's more trouble than it's worth. And they stay kind of within their nuclear family or their extended family, which can also be helpful. But the research does show being more embedded in the kind of community can be very helpful for these, for men, middle-aged men and middle-aged people in general.
Well, and that brings up another point that I was going to ask you is how does the increase of depression, anxiety correlate maybe with the loss of social connectivity? As we get older, of course, we do have friends that move away for retirement. They want to move to sunny Florida, and suddenly our best friend is now 2,500 miles away, or different things start to happen. Even retirement, when we talk about, and it's a little cliched, but cliches sometimes are true. Somebody reaches retirement age, they retire, and then the next thing you know is a year and a half, 2 years later, they're dead. But has there been any study or correlation between the decrease in social network to increases of depression, anxiety, or even suicide?
So we do know that what is known in the literature as social support, which is basically having a social kind of group around you who are willing to offer you support, emotional support, instrumental support, help you mow the lawn, help you fix your car, give you a lift if your car's broken down, etc. So we have this concept of social support, and we do know that a lack of social support is very strongly related to depression and also to suicide and also to substance use issues. And we know that people who have good levels of social support, good levels of social integration, tend to have much lower rates of depression and suicide. And there was a sociologist from the 19th century called Durkheim who wrote a famous book about suicide, who actually in 300 pages beautifully outlined the theory and used data comparing kind of Catholics, Protestants and Jews and their levels of like social integration and suicide. And since then, that's probably one of the most well-established facts of the psychiatric literature, which is why a lot of mental health interventions, and especially a lot of innovative ones for men, are really trying to aim to reinsert men back into some kind of social community. So we have therapies like taking some medication, which can help with symptoms, or we have therapies like talking to a psychologist, which can allow you to kind of process your feelings, and psychologists can teach you techniques to help you deal with the stresses of life. But there are other interventions which are proving very exciting, like there's an intervention called men's sheds, which you may be aware of, which are basically like youth clubs for older men. They're like a physical building which will be in a town or in a location, and they started in Australia, where there'll be some tools and a workshop and maybe a kitchen and maybe a small garden, and men can engage in woodwork. They can create tables, they can create chairs, they can do metalwork, they can do gardening, grow vegetables, they can cook for each other. And the early evaluations just showing that these can be very helpful for lonely and isolated men. One, it gives them something to do. Two, a lot of the activities they do are actually socially helpful. So some of the men's sheds, for example, will make tables and benches for like local parks, which then people can use. And you see somebody sitting at a bench that you made enjoying themselves, that makes you feel good. And three, it often involves like mentorship and peer-to-peer learning and knowing new skills. So every man has some skills that they can bring to the table. One man might be good at doing the accounting and keeping the Excel spreadsheet and can teach other guys how to do the computers. And another man might be much more manual and will be able to teach people the basic skills of carpentry. Another man might be a great cook and will be able to make the lunch and show some of the other guys, this is how you make good Italian food or whatever. So the data shows those social support deficits can be important in the etiology of mental illness, and the data also shows that those interventions which try to get men together and get them engaging in a kind of shared activity where there's meaning and purpose can be very helpful in helping men with mental health issues.
I like that, and I'll be sure to put a link to some of the books and articles that we're discussing into the show notes so people can discover those, such as the Men's Shed. So if somebody is interested in getting involved in their area or recommending this to somebody in their family or network, there's at least some information for it, even if you don't have one right in your community.
I mean, I'll just say one more small thing. I know in the US, I know it's a big thing that there's some more innovative kind of research which has been happening recently is about what's known as bushcraft interventions or wilderness interventions. And these are outlined in my book. I've got a whole chapter discussing these because they're so important. And this is the idea that that men for 2 days at a weekend or for a week, they take a week off work, they go into the wilderness and they're with some other men and usually with one person who is quite skilled in this. And they will catch fish. They'll cook their own fish. They'll build their own shelters. Someone will teach them foraging skills and about, these are the mushrooms that you can eat. These are the mushrooms that will kill you. These are the mushrooms that will make you high. This is edible. This is not edible. This is how you make a shelter, etc. And this stems from research on Aboriginal mental health or the mental health of Canadian First Nation, American Indians, where this is what they will often do in response to kind of someone feeling low or feeling depressed, to try and get them in touch with nature and to teach them new skills. And there's some recent evaluations of these programs showing that they're actually very helpful for men's mental health or men who are having kind of issues. So you've got these men's sheds, you've got these bushcraft wilderness interventions, and then you have other kind of civil society programs. Like I've been involved in kind of veterans peer support organizations where older veterans help younger veterans who have been recently discharged kind of navigate the system and try and get a job and get back into society once they've been discharged from the military, and especially if they have PTSD issues. So in a way, what I'm saying in all this is that you have the official mental health care system where you have psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, hospitals, clinics, which is obviously very important for many people and should be used if necessary. But for the more kind of minor cases or for the more everyday cases, the soft kind of mental health issues I talked about earlier, which might be kind of isolation, loneliness, a bit of lack of meaning, like you say, friends all moved away, a lot of working a lot of hours, and maybe men who are divorced, etc. These civil society kind of non-health service programs are really what I think are very helpful and also appealing to the typical man's kind of interests, like being outdoors, being active, being with other guys, being able to joke and banter and have some humor. And not just being about medication and sitting across the table talking to a psychologist.
Well, and I think the last part is very important. Not that what you said wasn't, but the idea of being able to have that banter back and forth. When I was playing softball even a few years ago, one of the biggest things as we're warming up, I'm just throwing a ball back and forth with somebody so we can loosen our shoulders and elbows up before the game, was asking somebody what's going on in your life, and it wasn't tell me your deepest, darkest secrets, of course, because men don't necessarily do that, but it was, how's work going? What's going on? Do you guys have any vacation coming up? How's the wife? How are the kids? And just that checking in is something that I know when I stopped playing softball, I did miss some of those conversations. And those were the informal checking in type of things. Also, the idea of the joking around between men that sometimes from the outside, women or others can view as being negative, or how can you joke like that, or whatever. But there's a programming inside of us sometimes that makes us want to poke each other and see how well can you take it and how well can you give it, because it's almost a sign of affection amongst some people. I won't say everybody, but amongst some people, to be able to come in and joke about something that somebody on the outside would find completely horrific, that somebody would be, making that joke or calling that deficiency out with the other person.
Yeah, and that fits exactly the kind of theory of these programs that we're talking about, these interventions, that when your men are together over an activity, it allows them to kind of be themselves, and also in a way to revisit their youth, where when most of us were young, we were eager to go out into the world, kind of go fishing, climb up trees, tease our friends, get up to no good, have a few little scraps, etc. And most of us look back to those days with fondness. And in a way, the boy is always inside the man, even as the man ages. And I think it's true to outsiders if they watch a group of men, whether it's playing a sport or having a barbecue or on a boat, going on a trip on a lake or in the water. It might look kind of immature or puerile, but all that humor and banter serves a kind of bonding purpose. The teasing, like you said, or playing practical jokes on each other. To an outsider, it could look kind of mean or semi-passive aggressive, etc. But I think a lot of men know that it's not. It's actually part of the fun of being together and trusting your buddies and your friends. And so, like I said, the programs that really, to me, have a lot of potential and are showing early signs of success are these new programs, which allows men to kind of be themselves and get together with other men. And I'm sorry, you might have to beat me out, kind of just shoot the shit with
right.
with men, rather than in a psychiatry clinic where you sit and it's all very, hello, doctor. Yes, I feel bad. I was crying last night. And yes, sir, no, sir.
One question I've got for you, and it's a little bit of a change of topic, but something that we've been mentioning is, have there been much research in terms of depression, mental health issues, as especially North American, Europe economies have moved more towards information economies versus manufacturing? Meaning, the job that I have as an IT project manager, I can't go with my children or grandchildren, point to something and say, hey, I helped create that. I helped build that. Here's a physical thing that I helped do. Because the things that I do don't exist in the physical world. And and I guess what I'm getting at is there a loss of being able to say, hey, I worked as an iron worker on this building, or I helped to build these vehicles, or I helped to do, something where it's much more tangible to point at, versus some of us that go to work and then it's, there's no book that comes out of it. There's no anything, even though what we do is important. It's just bits and bytes and data that's traveling around.
Yeah. I'd go back to Erickson's concept of generativity. And Erickson says that the important thing for fulfillment in middle years in particular is having, I guess, what we could call a legacy, or having products. I don't really like to use that word, but having things which you can point to and say, I helped in the development of this. And that could be your children. It could be in being involved in your local community. It could be physical objects as well. If you're someone who is a builder and you build houses, or you're a gardener, and I live opposite a kind of beautiful garden here who takes care of trees and flowers. And if you work in transport and you're getting people from A to B. So I think it's less important that it is actually a physical product, but it is important that people in their middle years feel that they have a legacy, or they're building a legacy, or that they've done with their life has been helpful to some group of people somewhere. And for many people, many men in Western societies, we get that from our employment. But there are many routes to that legacy and to that product generation outside of employment, from what you do at the weekend, what you do in your spare time. Some people are in like the military reserve, they're volunteer firefighters, they're helping out their neighbors, their elderly neighbor in more informal manner. So I think the importance is to think about kind of legacy and product, and it's never too late to start building this for a human. I wrote the book that you mentioned in the introduction about men's mental health. That's the first book that I've ever written. I'm 49. I've been wanting to write a book since I was 20, and the pandemic actually finally gave me a chance to have a bit of extra time than I anticipated without commuting time, etc., and was able to get that off the shelf. So I think it's less about the physicality of what's being generated, but the fact that things are being kind of generated and that there's some legacy, and that you're leaving a little ripple in the universe somewhere as you're progressing from cradle to grave, hopefully not too far to the grave. But
because I think underlying everybody has a sense of wanting to have life have a purpose or a meaning or something that you can point to and say, hey, I contributed to this, whatever this is that you find pride in. So and you brought up a great point too, is that for example, in my case, it may be looking towards how the family has developed and grown with some of my influence and the positivity of what the family has done. And that's not to say that, oh, everybody obeys me and everybody does everything and we're a perfect family or anything like that. But it could be that sense of, hey, my sons have been able to do this. They're productive. They're, whatever those positives are out of that, I think that's important that we can take that away as well. And not something that I'd thought about before.
Most definitely. And what I would like to be very careful to say is I'm certainly also not advocating that. I'm not equating generativity with necessarily highfalutin kind of work achievements or educational achievements. And Erickson and the scholars who work on this issue would say the same thing. A successful generativity could be certainly, when I look at my life, for example, I have paid how can I say it politely, a whole load of taxes in my life. I live in Quebec, which is one of the most highly taxed provinces in Canada, and probably more than any of the 50 states in the US. But at the end of the day, I stroll down the road and I see a policeman, and I see a school, and I see our Canadian Armed Forces parading, who went to Afghanistan and helped out there. I'm thinking, well, I worked hard and my money has gone to help us live in this society, which I'm able to enjoy. As you just said, when you've generated, 1, 2, 3 or more children, and they've generated your grandchildren, and you can look at them and say, my son or my daughter is a well-adapted, kind, hardworking, pleasant person, and is a good member of the community and contributes to society. That is obviously a huge sign of generativity and sign of a legacy and success, and something which men and women could focus on who have had that successful course of life. So I'm definitely not equating this with getting a PhD or becoming a CEO or starting a business, or and men should never beat themselves up about this. And when we get to like our 50s, we do look back and think about the what ifs, or I could have done this, or I could have done that. But better to focus on what you have done and to look broadly at what the ripples you have created in the universe, and think about that positively.
No, and I think that's important. That what you said is especially to avoid the comparisons, right? And I can be guilty of this, is I can sit here and go, oh, I'm 52 years old. When so-and-so was 52 years old, they had created and built a Fortune 100 company, right? Well, I'm not that person. It's not a fair comparison. I had my own life and events and things going on, interest and whatnot. That person did what they did, and that's great. But But I think sometimes it's just natural to get caught up in the comparison. We have to check ourselves a little bit and say, that's not fair to me, and it's not fair to that person, because maybe that person has a horrible family life and I've got a great family life. You know, I don't know. But
well, I was going to say that person has probably been divorced 3 times and has been horrible to his ex-wives and doesn't talk to his kids and treats his employees like pieces of dirt. So, yeah, I think like the dignity of being there's a huge dignity in being just a hardworking person in whatever field you've chosen, and supporting your children and your family, and paying your taxes, and whatever time or energy you have left over after that, being a good citizen and contributing somehow to society. That's how we live in these societies, that we have freedoms and peace and good government and able to enjoy our lives because of millions of people making those small decisions.
One of the things I want to pivot a little bit is to talk about one of your recent articles. You had talked about how men will sometimes avoid getting help or assistance with mental health, possibly due to real or perceived pressures from their occupations. And wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, as far as is that perception something that's still very real, or is it something that's part of a man's hang up, so to speak, about not wanting to reach out for help, that they create a false narrative that if somebody at work finds out that I need to leave at 4:00 to go to a therapist appointment, that I'll be passed over for promotion, I'll have responsibilities taken away, you know, these types of things.
So what you're basically describing is a concept that we call stigma in mental health research. And we know, very crudely, we can divide stigma into 2 different types of stigma, what we call internal stigma and external stigma. So internal stigma is really the ideas that people have in their own head, which may or may not be accurate. So, for example, I might say to myself, imagine I had depression, I might say to myself, I don't want to go to see a doctor because I feel that's inconsistent with being a strong, upstanding male. And this goes against my core beliefs that I've had since a child, that men should be able to deal with problems on their own, and you know, I watched John Wayne movies when I was younger, and I want to be the John Wayne character. What I said in that article, and I say more in my book, is that there's been a huge focus in the psychiatric literature and the psychological literature, and also on social media and on, in general, everyday societal conversations, on internal stigma, but not enough on external stigma. And external stigma is the kind of stigma that's held by people outside in society, whether that be journalists and the media, employers and workplaces, teachers and educationalists, landlords, people who own restaurants or small businesses, etc. And what we do know from the research, which is kind of understated, I'm trying to bring this more to the foreground of the discussion, is that there is still a huge amount of kind of external stigma against men who have mental health issues. Men are still the primary breadwinner for the family, despite decades of change in gender relations. Their income is necessary to pay the mortgage, to bring up the kids, to pay for food and regular household expenses. And we do know that many workplaces will equate mental illness with kind of laziness or malingering or hypochondria. We know that in certain workplaces, for example, the military, the police, where there's like dangerous or hazardous chemicals, oil, gas, there will be beliefs that men with mental illness are a danger or a threat to kind of unit morale, or even a physical threat, that they might do something illegal in the workplace, which will threaten the whole employee's well-being. So what I say is that this really does exist out there, and many men will be scanning their environment and will have this knowledge, thinking, well, if I told my boss, if I told my colleagues, if I told people in the workplace I'm leaving early to go and see a psychiatrist to get medication for depression, would I be treated differently if I said I'm leaving early because I'm going to see a doctor because I've been diagnosed with diabetes and I need to get some insulin? And I think bitter experience and research shows that men are aware that there will be a lot of costs to revealing that they have a mental illness to people in the workplace. And in my article, I said that a lot of men engage in a cost-benefit analysis, a kind of mental cost-benefit analysis, where they will come to the conclusion that it's better not to talk about their mental health issues in the workplace and better to try and kind of manage it themselves through kind of exercise or through engaging in more hobbies or from doing stuff at the weekend, because they feel that if their employee found out, it could affect their ability to be the primary breadwinner, and nobody wants to risk being passed over for unemployment, for promotion, or being at the front of the line when cost-cutting measures are coming and they need to fire people. So I think these are like legitimate concerns, and like I said, I feel the literature has put too much focus on internal stigma, which is still an issue, and there are many people working on that, and not enough on the kind of external stigma that needs to be combated.
Well, and I think too that and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's probably a correlation between trying to self-medicate through whatever substance versus going and getting the mental health help that's needed, right? It's I can't sleep at night because of the anxiety, so I'm going to drink more, or I'm going to consume drugs that help me sleep. And then, that starts to produce its own set of issues that get out of control. But it feels like there's sometimes, I don't know, this may sound really weird, but in certain circumstances, it may still be almost better to go, hey, Greg's taking 30 days to go to rehab for alcohol abuse, versus if Greg came to his manager and said, hey, I'm having a lot of trouble. I've got, some things going on. I need to leave an hour early, every Thursday for right now to go see, somebody for mental health issues. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but it feels like there's still this weird kind of, to your point with the diabetes, right? Hey, I can have an extreme chronic case of one thing versus telling somebody that I'm having a really hard time with work or life at the moment.
Yeah, most definitely. And what we do know is that whenever anybody has a mental illness or has what we could call emotional distress or mental issues, that person will react in a certain way and will try and manage the issues somehow. And as you said right at the beginning, some people will self-medicate with kind of alcohol or with illegal drugs or cannabis, other issues, other substances, gambling, use of pornography. Other men will, we know, engage in a lot of more exercise, for example. And that can be helpful, but if it goes to a certain level, it can be unhelpful. Other men will do more outdoor activity, will try and get more involved in their family. Some men work longer hours, try and bury themselves in their workplace. Not all of these responses are dysfunctional, and some of them can be adaptive and can be helpful. But at the end of the day, it is useful, especially in more severe cases, to have a professional kind of guiding you and helping you on that process and talking about the different choices and whether they're lifestyle choices that can help you or medication choices or therapeutic choices. And I think the official mental health care system has a lot to do to make their services more appealing to men, to get them into the treatment services, and then to open up the world to them and give them this series of options, like I said, because I think many men feel that the health service is a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. There's been some papers published. There was one from the UK, which basically, I think the title of the paper was "Are Mental Health Services Feminized?" And they basically imply that the the traditional mental health service where you go and see a doctor, give you medication, or sit face to face over a table and talk about your emotions and feelings. But this is a kind of feminized way of interacting. Also that the 80-90% of psychologists, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists tend to be female. And that some men, that's fine, but other men prefer a kind of male to male therapist or kind of male space. Some research shows like the waiting rooms in these services, there's typically like women's magazines or things like this, which kind of make some men feel it's not really a place for them to be. So there's all these interacting factors, but the reality is everybody reacts to emotional distress, and sometimes in maladaptive ways and sometimes in more adaptive ways. And the clinical system needs to kind of establish what's happening and work with that and harness the adaptive reactions and try and diminish the maladaptive reactions.
I agree, and that's great information. I want to pivot again as we're getting close to wrapping up this conversation. And what I'd like to know is if you can help us with how best can we talk to somebody that may be suffering, where we notice, maybe the depression, or we notice that something's off with somebody. Because I think sometimes we have, especially it can be tough for a son or daughter to go to their father, or to an uncle, or somebody that they feel close enough to go, hey, something's wrong. Can we be of help to get you into whether it's services or connect with you or listen?
Sure. Great question. I would say three pieces of advice I could give to the average person out there who wants to help a man who might be struggling. One is that the motto of a men's shed is that men talk shoulder to shoulder, not face to face. And I think we can all learn from that. It's very true. If we think of how when men are talking and having deep conversations, it's rarely kind of sitting across the table, eye to eye, face to face. I just talk about my own experience or some of my friends, going for a walk along the beach or on the boardwalk, or going for a small hike up a mountain, and two men talking about their lives. Going for a drive, many men will be driving their sons or grandchildren to hockey practice or baseball practice, and you're driving through the dark roads for an hour. That's a good time to talk. Just going fishing, you're sitting next to each other on a riverbank. People start talking, and there's something about being kind of face to face, eye to eye contact, which can be a bit intimidating for men, and that it's not a kind of mode of talking which many of us have been raised with. And in fact, some research shows when a men talking face to face, when they're being told off by the school principal, or when they're being told off by their mother and father, wagging a finger and them telling them, don't do this, don't do that. So first advice I'd say is do something shoulder to shoulder if you want to talk to somebody. Second is, which is kind of related to the first, try and do it over an activity and make the activity like kind of the central point, not the talk, the central point. So don't say we need to have a talk. Say something like, we haven't been up Mount Washington recently. Let's go for a hike up there. Or we haven't been fishing. Like let's go fishing. Or I want to teach you. Or I want to show you some new skills I've got. Or whatever. Try and work with their energy, harness their energy. If the person you want to talk to likes going out on a boat, say let's go out on the boat. I'll sit next to you. Show me the places you like. So when you do it over an activity, there's less of that intensity as well. And the third thing I would say is don't use the official language of kind of mental health of psychiatry. Try and use more the language of some research has shown using the language of sports or the language of education is much more helpful than using mental health language. So to say, if you end up giving advice, to say something like, well, I know someone downtown who can really help you, is a kind of life coach who can help you in mental training and help your mental fitness. That's better than saying, I know someone downtown who's a psychologist who can give you cognitive behavioral therapy. So using the language of training, fitness, mental strength, mental resilience, that this is much more attractive to many men if they are able to say to themselves and their friends and family and colleagues, I'm going for a weekly session of mental training or of mental coaching or of mental fitness, and saying I'm going for a weekly session of psychological therapy. So I would say those three things, shoulder to shoulder, over an activity. And if it gets to the stage where you're talking about kind of mental health and plans of action and pathways, try and use like the language of sports or the language of resilience, the language of kind of triumph or movement, rather than the language of like deficits, the language of psychology and the language of psychiatry.
That's good advice. And Rob, as we're wrapping this up, is there anything that I haven't asked you about in terms of mental health for men, or anything that you would like to bring up that I just haven't asked you about?
I think it's natural in every stage of life that men are going to have different issues and different challenges. And when you get to the middle years, there are specific challenges. Like you said, many men experiencing divorce, the kids are growing up and flying the nest. For some men, that's a great triumph, and they're glad for the extra space. And for others, that's a loss as the kids move away. Like I said, the body is naturally weakening as it grows older. There are physical health issues that we're all facing. There is this sense that I said earlier that for some people, maybe they haven't achieved what they wanted in life, but it sounds like a really trite cliche, but like just, be easy on yourself. Think about the positives rather than the negatives. You can look back on your life and look to the future, and you can see things you wanted to do differently, or things that might be going in a path that you didn't anticipate. But it's hopefully for a lot of us middle-aged guys, there's still a lot of life left. There's a lot of things to do. We've amassed a lot of wisdom and knowledge in our 50, 60 years on Earth. We've amassed a lot of pain and bitter experience as well, and we can use that to help the younger generation. And if anyone is interested further in my work, I just wrote a book called Men's Issues and Men's Mental Health, where there's 10 chapters which go into the various things we've talked about today. And I also write a monthly blog for Psychology Today called Talking About Men, where I talk about men's issues. And I have a YouTube channel called Recovery Mental Health, where we upload documentaries about mental health and mental health issues. And our latest one was one on military veterans who were in Afghanistan, who have chronic pain issues and how they're trying to manage that chronic pain, looking at things like medical cannabis, opioids, addictions, alcohol. And it's a hopeful, positive video. So I hope anyone out there would go and watch it.
Well, and I'll be sure to put those into the show notes as well for links, make it easy for people to find it. And Rob, I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us on the Cool Grandpa podcast. This has been a really educational experience and a fun experience to engage with you about this important topic. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. And it's great to be able to reach so many people. So thanks for having me, Greg.
What a great conversation with Rob. I really enjoyed this idea of men's sheds. I think it's really important that guys have a place to go, some place to hang out, some place where they can either explore new interests, or if they've had to downsize into an apartment or a townhome or something else, they've got an opportunity to go somewhere where there's some woodworking tools and some metalworking tools to be able to build some benches to help out their neighbors, their community. I think it's really great that Rob is spending a lot of time and effort and research on older men's mental health issues. I think it's one of those things where we kind of know that it's going on, but we really don't fully understand what's happening to us as we're getting older. So please check out the great work that Rob's doing and some of his articles. It may be a great way for you to start a conversation with somebody in your network about mental health. Rob gave us some great ideas about how to start those conversations. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm glad that you listened. Hopefully it gave you some tools and some inspiration on how to handle situations when you need to talk to somebody about when you're noticing some depression, or if you're experiencing that yourself, or any of the other mental health issues that we discussed. So, until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.